This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Dissent, a democratic socialist magazine of politics and culture. Dissent's summer issue, America at 250, is out now. The issue features a special section on the country's 250th anniversary from the perspective of the left. Many in the United States and around the world have worked to build on the American tradition, to remake it, to call it to live up to its commitments, to make its rhetoric real. What can this anniversary mean to us? Other articles and reviews in the issue cover Operation Metro Surge, the United Farm Workers, the Jewish Labor Bund, artificial intelligence, and more. Subscribe today to get your copy at dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. You'll get 3 issues per year, as well as digital access to 70 years of archives. That's dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 6th episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation, one whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. This episode begins with one of the worst acts of political violence of the 20th century, the mass murder of Indonesian communists. It was a genocide that successfully aimed to destroy the PKI, the world's largest communist party outside of China and the Soviet Union, through the murder of between 500,000 and 1 million people. Some estimates, in fact, go as high as 3 million killed. Suharto deposed Sukarno and inaugurated the authoritarian and corrupt New Order regime, which would remain in power until Suharto's fall in 1998. The pretext for the mass killing was the 30th of September movement, or G30S, a group of left-wing junior military officers who captured and killed senior officers in what they described as an effort to preempt a right-wing military coup against Sukarno. Suharto, head of Kostrad, the powerful Army Strategic Command Unit, immediately moved to put down the rebellion, to seize control of the country, and to set into motion a clearly planned program of mass murder across the archipelago. It was a mass murder campaign made in partnership with militias associated with traditionalist Muslim Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, and also in partnership, perhaps surprisingly, with the right wing of Sukarno's Indonesian National Party, or PNI. The PNI was Sukarno's party, but it was also a party with a large bureaucratic component, staunchly anti-communist civil servants. China's communist leadership had urged Sukarno and the PKI to develop a so-called fifth force of peasant and worker militias. That didn't happen. The PKI's parliamentary approach under leader Dian Adit made it hesitant to take up arms. Such a move risked provoking the military. Plus, the party had already been destroyed twice as a result of it carrying arms, in 1927 and 1948. There was a last-ditch effort to develop a fifth force with Chinese help, but it came too late. Tellingly, Suharto wasn't among the generals captured by G30S. Indeed, the movement's leaders had been Suharto's subordinates in the past, and evidence clearly suggests that they believed that they had the support of their former commanding officer and comrade in arms. Suharto betrayed them, and, with U.S. support, he murderously ended the PKI and the long Indonesian revolution that had first kicked off with the emergence of nationalist, anti-colonial, and communist politics in the 1920s. nationalist and communist consciousness had emerged in the early 20th century and became turbocharged under Japanese occupation. Militant mass energies that poured into the Indonesian Revolution, which in turn led right into the politically explosive decade and a half of Sukarno ruling a sovereign Indonesia. Indonesia had become defined by militant mass politics. The New Order regime would seek to make Indonesians into a depoliticized people, what top Suharto military leader Ali Mortopo called a, quote, floating mass. A mass imbibing a constant stream of propaganda, luridly defaming the PKI and celebrating a corporatist anti-political vision of Pancasila. Political parties were forcefully merged into regime-compliant vehicles. The New Order cracked the economy wide open to Western capitalists. Western capitalist powers and Japan reciprocated by pouring massive funds into the country that would stabilize the regime. The regime's economic model was drawn up by modernization theory-inspired economists known as the Berkeley Mafia, named for the university where they completed their graduate studies. It involved the widespread looting of Indonesian natural resources. Sukarno's Indonesia had been on the vanguard of Third Worldist revolution. Suharto's New Order was squarely within the U.S. imperialist orbit. The seeds of New Order were sown by the contradictions of Sukarno's revolution. The military only grew in power as Sukarno waged conflicts against Darul Islam, against regional rebels in the outer islands, against the Dutch in West Papua, and through confrontasi against the British establishment of Malaysia. Nationalized Dutch industries became cash cows for the military, even as the economy spiraled into deeper crisis. The military maintained its own parallel political order down to the village level through the system of territorial command. Until 1965, Sukarno had balanced his regime upon the contradictory power blocks of the military and PKI. The former would deploy its vast apparatus of organized violence to destroy the latter. The New Order state, with extraordinary brutality, provisionally resolved the contradictions of Sukarno's Indonesia. But Suharto's corrupt regime contained plenty of its own contradictions, which would, in 1998, lead to the fall of New Order and transition to democracy, a process of reform or reformasi that remains incomplete and contested to this day. All of which we'll discuss next week in the final episode of Nusantara. Before we get this thing rolling, this podcast takes a lot of work, which means it also takes some money. The way we raise funds to keep it all running with zero paywalls on any episodes is through listeners like you making contributions at patreon.com/thedig. This podcast, The Dig, it's a political education project. You, the listeners, make it possible. Plus, only Patreon supporters can get access to our incredible swag, mugs, totes, hats, and truly stellar Dig t-shirts. Please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Rianne Subijanto, Mare Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 6 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, Indoprogress.com. Mare Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is currently working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Let's turn to this really pivotal incident in Indonesian history, the precipitating event for Suharto's coup and the mass murder of communists. It took place on October 1st, 1965, when a group of left-wing officers calling themselves the 30th of September movement rounded up a number of senior military officers and killed them. They claimed that they acted to prevent a right-wing military coup against Sukarno, but Suharto quickly moved to put down the left-wing officers, to seize control of the military, and then to murderously seize control of the entirety of Indonesia. Nasution, the very powerful military chief of staff and defense minister, he was targeted for kidnapping but escaped from the coup plotters and survived, and yet it was not Nasution who would take power. It was Suharto. And making matters even more strange, Suharto wasn't targeted by the left-wing officers because, in fact, most of the left-wing officers had previously served as Suharto's subordinates. So these officers who mounted this supposed left-wing coup, they considered Suharto to be an ally, even a patron. Lay out what happened on October 1st, 1965, and the days that followed. There are many competing theories as to the true nature of the 30th of September movement and as to how Suharto, how he managed to seize control of the situation so quickly, so effectively, setting into motion a plan to consolidate power, to isolate and then depose Sukarno, to conduct a campaign of mass murder that was so systematic. It's so much that it's hard to believe that it was improvised. What's your assessment as to what happened on those fateful days?
So this question of what happened on the eve of October 1st, 1965 is one of the most debated questions with a lot at stakes. The answer depends on whose perspective that you want to follow and also which archives that's available. So more knowledge emerged as more archives were revealed. On the night of September 30th, 65, a group calling itself the 30th of September movement, or in Indonesia, we call it G30S, and then ended with PKI. But G30S, they kidnapped senior army generals. 6 generals were killed. General Nasution, as you mentioned, then escaped, although his daughter was actually fatally wounded. And the movement claimed that it was acting to stop a right-wing council of generals from overthrowing Sukarno. Now, within the first days, the narrative was rapidly dominated by the army. They controlled radio, newspapers, and military power, and monopolized information and quickly disseminated this through those means. By October the 2nd, Suharto, at the time he was the commander of the strategic command called Kostrat, he had taken effective control of Jakarta. Suharto himself was not targeted by the kidnappers. As you said also, then several of the officers actually involved in the movement had actually previously served under Suharto. And then one of the movement's leaders, his name is Colonel Latif, he actually met Suharto at a hospital the night before the movement, while Suharto's son Tommy was being treated for burns. But until now, we actually don't know the nature of this meeting because we don't have any data or archive on it, right? But the information and the propaganda that was quickly disseminated within days through the military-controlled radio and newspapers, they all presented the movement as a PKI coup attempt and cast the military as the defender of the nation. So within days, a lot of this press was basically either closed or brought in under military control. Now, there is a communist, the PKI newspaper, Harian Rakyat. If you read them within those first 2 days, they did not actually call for communist revolution the next day. They described the movement as primarily an internal army affair and expressed support for the movement's goal of protecting Sukarno from reactionary generals. And this is very important because it will complicate later claims that the entire PKI organization had launched a coordinated coup. Now, you asked about what are the theories of the nature of the event. I'm going to just highlight the canons or the most important classics work on this topic. One of the earliest major studies was actually the so-called Cornell paper. It was written in 1966 by Ben Anderson. We call him Om Ben among us. And then also Ruth McVeigh, who was actually also a writer of the history of communism in 1920s, right? But the paper was circulated internally. It's not published until 71. What they both argue is that the event looked more like an internal military conflict than a straightforward PKI coup, and that younger officers, they appeared central to the operation. And then there was tension within the army too. So the paper directly, of course, challenged the official military narrative at the time, right? And also because of this paper, Om Ben was later not allowed to enter Indonesia during the New Order era. Now, after the overthrow of the New Order regime, just remember, during the regime, there is no access to archive, etc., right? The narrative is very much controlled. But after the overthrow of the Suharto's regime in 98, new archives emerged and new interpretation emerged. And one of the most influential studies is John Rusa's Pretext for Mass Murder. He rejects the New Order claim that the PKI as an organization planned and executed a coup. Instead, he argues that only a small group of party leaders around the inaugurated actually who were involved, and that most party members had actually no knowledge of the movement. So in a way, the movement was real, but the army used it as a pretext to destroy the entire left instead of just like this small group of dissident military officers who were close with the inaugurated, right? Then there is also The Killing Season by Jeff Robinson. He focuses less on who started G30S and more on what followed after that. His question is not who organized the movement, but how the army transformed it into a justification for one of the 20th century's largest campaign of political violence. And whatever the origins of the operation, what we know, and from Jeff's book, it's clear that the military response was very much rapid, coordinated, and systematic and expansive, right, across the archipelago. And so he argues that October the 1st became G30S became the pretext for the destruction of the PKI, the removal of Sukarno, and the construction of the New Order. Then there is Annie Polman's book, Women's Sexual Violence and the Indonesian Killings of 65 and 66, which basically shows how women were uniquely targeted during the anti-communist massacres and the New Order repression. She shows how gendered violence, sexual torture, imprisonment, and propaganda against organizations like Gerwani, the Indonesian Communist Women's Gerakan Wanita, the Indonesian Women Movement organization were actually central. So this gender violence was actually very central to not peripheral to the destruction of the Indonesian left and the construction of Suharto's regime, right? So essentially, she also argues that the New Order systematically destroyed the political subjectivity of women. And then later on, under the New Order era, it's reduced to political actors to depoliticize women, wives, and mothers. And the most important contribution of recent time is 2018 by Jess Melvins, The Army and the Indonesian Genocide, Mechanics of Mass Murder. She it's really amazing because she gained access, and I heard it was accidental actually. She gained access to thousands of pages of previously secret military and intelligence documents. And these archives show direct military involvement in organizing and coordinating the annihilation campaign. So, in a way that immediately the military uses its structure and its the command line to do this annihilation. They call it penumpasan, annihilate, basically, total annihilation. So with her findings, it makes it very difficult to maintain, the older interpretation that the killings were simply spontaneous explosions of local anger. This evidence points instead to military planning, command structures, and coordinated implementation. And she also shows us the existence of these central command structures and orders of annihilation rather than this uncontrolled local violence.
I'll just add a little bit because of the pattern. First is about the coup itself. John Rusa's books, I think, showed us about some section of the military. This is the movement of some sections within the military. This is a conflict, internal conflict in the military, and the involvement, a small elite inside the Communist Party, Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, in the movement. This is the central claim of the corner paper, written by three people, actually. I think they want to miss one, Fred Banal, who diligently scoring all of the archive during that time, and then worked with his teachers at that time, Ben Anderson and Ruth McFay. I think the argument is that this is the coup d'etat or internal military rivalries, especially from the young officers from the left. But I think the central questions of the corner paper is that it's very strange for a communist party that doesn't have any armed wings. Of course, PKE a couple of months before is already throwing the idea to have the fifth forces inside the other forces that we have, just like the army, the navy, the armed forces, and then the fifth forces would be and the police and the force, and the fifth would be the buruh and tani, the workers and the peasants and the farmers. They need to be armed also in order to at that time, in the middle of confrontation against the British, the birth of the state of Malaysia that Suharto didn't like. So that's kind of things, but it never materialized because of the objection from the army. But that's an idea. So instead, it's some couple of we really don't know what's going on. Several PKE elites then worked with the young Turks inside the military, which is a lot of them are Suharto subordinates that you said before. And one, I think, the leader of the movement, Lieutenant Colonel Untung, was, I think, the member of the military elites. He is a part of the Cakra Birawa, the Sukarno's bodyguards, and he got the highest honors, along with the later become the most notorious New Order General, Lieutenant General Benny Murdani. He got the Bintang Sakti, the highest medal of honors given by Sukarno for freeing the West Papua or Irian Barat at that time. So I think, I think it's reasonable that this kind of leftist people who are very, very good at the combat and then have a resentment against the generals. Most of them are the U.S. educated. You have to remember that 2,800 Indonesian generals at that time were educated in the U.S. before. So at the one side, you have the leftists who are, everything's working in the field doing the combat. And then the other side, you have the generals who have been in the U.S., trained in the U.S., and become an elite and living comfortably in Jakarta. So that's another dimension of these movements. And then I think we don't know why it's going very fast. Suharto took over the command, and then I think I was curious. I was really, really curious what's going on in the days after the coup, the failed coup, because then the army quickly building a narrative, especially against the women. The Gerwani had held a party in Lubang Buaya where the general's body was dumped. And before that, they have a party. So they slice the body of the general, which is not true. And they have a dancing. They have a party over there. They sang Genjer Genjer, the very popular song at the time, and connected it to the communists. It's actually the very, very simple song from East Java. So that kind of things, I think it is very, very complicated because we don't know much about that. But from the general pictures, we can see that some things happen within the military internally, but we don't know yet why it's become so a massive campaign by the army, and the army sees the opportunity to annihilate the communists.
Anna, I wanted to follow up because both you and Made mentioned the propaganda campaign launched almost immediately to demonize, in particular, communist women as demonic beings who had brutally sexually tortured the kidnapped generals. In this mythology, it was important to legitimating the mass killings as they were happening, which we'll get into in a moment, but it also became a really permanent feature of New Order propaganda. What did that propaganda campaign aim to convey, and what was its role in facilitating the mass killing as it unfolded?
Then, can I just say that this recording is very difficult to do for me. I'm sure also for Abi and Blimade. It's very emotional. It's so hard. I'm so angry and also very sad in a very deep way. So, okay. So just to say that if you hear me, my voice, shaking, it's because it's very hard to say. Anyway, what did the propaganda convey? So immediately after October the 1st, the army and its allies launched a massive propaganda campaign. Basically, the main point on a broader picture is that they portrayed the PKI as not merely political opponents, but as inhuman monsters. So the central claim was that PKI cadres, and especially women from Gerwani, they had tortured the kidnapped generals. This is what Blimade say, right? Mutilated their genitals, gouged out their eyes, danced naked around them, engaged. This is all slanders, right? And these stories were spread through this radio, newspapers, pamphlets, and later through film. So during the Suharto, the 32 years, this will be repeated, through films, museums, school textbooks, and annual commemorations. When we were kids, I don't know if Blimade and Abi experienced this, but I grew up in Jakarta, the capital. All students every year as an elementary school, just imagine, like kids, they had to watch this G30 SPKI document propaganda film. And we have to write an essay about it. So a kid watching very bloodshed movie and then write about it every year. We also would have to make a school trip to the Lubang Buaya Museum where, there is this story about Gerwani especially was repeated. So it's like the schools, essentially, an education system is like a factory to produce this mass fear and anti-communist ideas, right? And so the propaganda then portrayed communists not just as political enemies, but it also portrayed them as godless, sexually defiant, anti-family, anti-religious, and outside the bounds of humanity itself. So what role did the propaganda play? The propaganda helped transform political repression into a moral crusade. What used to be a conflict of, a struggle over power, right? As we see it throughout the 50s and the 60s, it's a struggle over power, ideology, and class. It becomes a struggle between civilization and barbarism. It becomes a struggle, against religion and atheism, against morality and depravity. So they depicted communists as monstrous and inhumane. And the army then created conditions which killing these people then become patriotic and become Islamic. Actually, for some people it becomes a jihad, for the Muslims. And the army systematically used fabricated stories and disinformation to generate support for the destruction of the PKI and to legitimize extraordinary violence, creating an atmosphere of, mass arrest, execution, and persecution, actually without actual judicial procedure. Now, you also ask, why were women so important, right? Annie Polman's book is actually very good because she shows that women occupied a very special place in this propaganda. And she talks about how Gerwani had been one of the largest women's organization in Indonesia that advocated for women's political participation, labor rights, literacy, and social welfare. But the military then transformed these politically active women into symbols of sexual disorder. They become sexualized, right? That story that I told you, how the women mutilated generals, that become the foundational myth of the new order. All kids knew it. But you know what? Subsequent investigations actually found no evidence for this claim. There is no evidence. But the story continued to be repeated and reproduced. So the stories basically help justify the arrest of thousands of women. These women were actually sexually tortured and raped. And then also they were forced to confess. And essentially, as a result, they destroyed the left-wing women's movement. So the destruction of PKI essentially is also the destruction of a particular vision of politically active womanhood.
What Anne has said is very true. I think really what you have to think about in the context of the new order is that they're trying to recreate a new kind of society. And it was one that is very fundamentally different from Sukarno's sort of revolutionary society. And you have to remember that in the 50s and 60s, the Indonesian population was highly politicized. And there was a lot of participation amongst women, amongst youth groups, and so forth. So it was a participatory society, and it was one that was not just participating at the national level, but also at the international level. How do you recreate the Indonesian man and women into a particular corporatist form in which they don't have a voice? So why the level of violence that was meted out to both communist women and to the communist parties is really not merely to eliminate communism, but it was to actually engender trauma within the Indonesian population. That to determine that if you achieve this form of independence and participation, this is what happens to you. So it's a form of disciplining an entire nation, and it's a form of trying to create a new form of Indonesian man that is meek, that is very compliant, that I think in a lot of sense, we are still actually much more as a son and daughter of that trauma. So it really fundamentally changes the Indonesian nation because it debased our basic integrity as human being to participate. So it was a brilliant political, but also psychological act by this new regime, because you had to change this highly revolutionized society, a society that was very much within part of this global South revolution, into one that is very meek, that is very compliant, that doesn't participate much. And you can actually, you can see how Indonesians don't participate much in a lot of stuff afterwards. We're all still sort of trapped within this new order trauma, even after the new order has collapsed, I think. So it takes a long time And you have to also remember that they destroyed not just the Communist Party, but academia in general, the arts and so forth. So all of these budding expressions of independence, of revolution, of the kind of ideas that our nationalism initially started since the early 20th century, they were all destroyed. And it was very hard to sort of recreate that afterwards.
Yeah, I think I added a little bit. I'm just curious, who create these narratives? Who are? It's not coming out of nowhere. In the days after the coup, the first thing that the Kostra did, Kostra is the army unit under Suharto, at that time is ready with the troops in Jakarta, and he's the only guys who has the troops ready. And then the first thing that they did it was to seize the radio, Republik Indonesian Radio, or RRI, Radio Republik Indonesia, and started this kind of propaganda. I was asking this question to Saskia Wiringa, who is also writing a lot of stuff about the movements and the women during that time. And then I asked her, who created this propaganda? Who created this very, very cruel images of the Gerwani? And there's no clear answer to that. But as a tactics, as a strategy of war, when I did a research in West Kalimantan in 1967, you know that there's an effort to crush the rebellion over there. Actually, the communist rebellions, this is an excess. The Indonesian trained the guerrilla from Sarawak and Sabah at that time during the confrontation. They trained the leftist guerrilla over there, but then after the political change in 1965, Indonesia has to crush the guerrilla that they had created before. And at that time, I found out one, not a document, but even this is a memoir from the local commander at that time, the Brigadier General Sumadi was his name. And he outlined the tactics to crushing the guerrilla. It's very, very clear. And he said that we launched a war, psychological war. We kidnapped a Dayak elderly. Dayak is a tribe, the indigenous tribe over there. We killed them. We killed these Dayaks, this elderly. We cut off his genitals and put in his mouth. And then we put the Chinese characters inside his body, an insult to the Dayak. And soon after that, the Dayak were mobilized, and then they held a ritual called Tariu, and they bring a red cup which has a blood inside it, chicken blood, and they distribute it. They bring it from one village to another village. So that's how they mobilize. And they mobilize. They because the Chinese at that time, there's a lot of Chinese living in the interior area at that time. The result is that they kick out all of the Chinese from the interior area, and the army set up a camp, refugees camp, and near the beaches in Singkawang, from Singkawang to Pontianak in the coastal areas without food. And I think Douglas Cameron, one of Indonesian political scientists, and Jamie Robinson, who's doing a work over there, figured it out. It's around 70,000 of the Chinese were living in there miserably. This kind of tactics, this is the Indonesian war tactics, anti-guerrilla tactics that they learn and they apply this everywhere, including in East Timor during Operasi Kikis in 1976 to 78. Yeah, a lot of people died. I think a third of Timorese died because of this kind of anti-guerrilla tactics. So I think you see a clear pattern to create the narratives, very cruel toward your perceived enemies, and very inhuman narratives. Depict them as the you call it, I think it's a very familiar in also in the Nazi German, they call their enemies as vermin. They are not human being. So they have to eliminate this world. You are justified to eliminate them from this world. So these kind of tactics, I think, are very cruel tactics. They become the Indonesian military tactics. And I think even until now, yeah.
Let's turn to the mechanics of the mass killing operation. Among the worst crimes of the 20th century globally, how did the military set up and then set into motion a killing machine that began in Banda Aceh and then proceeded across Java, Bali, and beyond? It was a system of mass killing orchestrated directly by the military, but that also involved the police, that was carried out by PNI militias and Islamist militias allied to Nahdlatul Ulama, which at the time was engaged in a brutal conflict with PKI-aligned peasants over land reform. There were also militias that had been mobilized for confrontasi under Sukarno that also played a role. How did this mass killing operation, orchestrated by the military but also carried out by various civilian groupings, how was it organized and how did it unfold, and how did it draw upon existing conflicts on the ground, like the struggle over land reform in Central and East Java?
I think, yeah, the killings were spread. I think first, you're right. The Aceh is the first who experienced killing, because the sentiment against the communists over there is I think, blend with the religious. It's a very, very different sentiment in Central Java, East Java, and Bali that you saw, where the highest number of people are killed over there. But then it's very, very unique in Aceh, because I suspect also in West Kalimantan, the leaders of the PKI is of Arab descent. So it's very, very different from the image that we have right now. The Arab descents were mostly Habaib, and Said. They are very religious. They are not. They are leftist enough at that time. So it's very specific. I think then the military get into the. They already have the pre-existing conditions in order to get a killing. But then in Central Java, I think it started by RPKAD, or led by this is the special forces. Now RPKAD renamed into the Kopassus, the very most notorious sections of the army. This is the elite of the army. They are recruited among the best from the military, but also has the very, very dark human rights track records. And it started by RPKAD, led by a man named Saroedi Wibowo, whose daughter later married to Indonesian, I think, sixth President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Yeah. So this Saroedi started in Central Java, in Yogyakarta. I think because in Yogyakarta they also killed the communists also killed two colonels who led the local military unit here, and then RPKAD moved in, and then it moved to the east. In Central Java, I think the perpetrators of the killers, or the killers, are mostly coming from the Nationalist Party, who were at that time fighting with PKI for the mass basis. I think a lot of them, they have a very, very similar mass base. The Nationalist Party, the Indonesian Nationalist Party, PNI, and PKI, they have a very similar mass basis, mostly abangan, rural people, nominal Javanese, mostly farmers, but PNI also has some roots in local low-level aristocracy and low-level bureaucracy. So this is the base of the PNI. Meanwhile, PKI in Central Java were very strong with the farmers and with the union, with the workers. In East Java, the case is a little bit different. It is Nahdlatul Ulama against all of the abangan. This is, I think, the basis is like in Central Java also. The basis was the roots of the conflict is agrarian conflicts. It turned into, I think, the military manipulated into anti-communist movement. So the military actually armed the people, especially the youth of the Nahdlatul Ulama, the youth of PNI, and armed them, and then they did the killings mostly, and then or they did the kangaroo court and give all of the victims or the give of the communists to the military, and then who will then give them to the usually in Java there's a special I think a very very typical, they dump the body into the lower with this is a cave going down, yeah, they dump the body over there. So I think you will find this all in all of the carts area from Central Java to the East Java. Also in the middle of Java, you will find a lot of mass graves in the Luang, in the vertical cave. And then it moved. I think it's not until December in 1965 it moves to Bali. The perpetrators mostly in Bali, PNI organized itself, created a mass organization called Tameng, which is in English it is shield. Yeah, this Tameng organizations is just like in Central Java. It's consisted of the farmers and youth, and then also low caste and high caste. So many things. It's a coalition, and the roots is also agrarian conflicts. And this is in Bali especially. The killings become intimate killings because the land conflicts occur between amongst families member over inheritance. The island is very small. The people who live over there is very it's a very densely populated. Land is for agriculture is scarce, so the conflict is very high. A conflict over a land very high, and then the military gives them. On this organization, that the killings become very ugly in Bali because they started killing the old people and babies, and then it's really hard for the RPKAD for the at that time Colonel Saru Edi Wibowo to stop it because of this intimate killing. So they feel justified. So a lot of people. Told me that the killings actually being ritualized. So they take the people out and put it in the village temples, and they have a ritual before that, and then after that they did the killing. So that's kind of thing. So a very ritualized, very intimate, and then you see all of the the sites, the typical killing that they bring it to the beach side. To the coastal area, especially the beach side. So a lot of mass graves. You find a lot of mass graves over there, including when I was kid. My family from mother sides coming from the Canggu areas. So when I was kid, when I played on the sand in the beach, I would find it's just very common that we see the bones over there. So it's a kind of I think in Bali. There's not so many people realize that all of the nice hotels, the big hotels from chains hotel business from around the world was erected on the beach sides, and that big business actually used to be the mass graves of the communists. So. That's the foundation of a Balinese tourism industry, the mass graves. And then before that, we don't have that kind of industry. And then after the killings, we have a lot of things going on. The best beaches has, I think, the most massacres.
I want to say that a good book for the case of Bali, and also just the most of recent one, is John Rusa's Buried Histories. One of the story there is about Puger, who is it's very hard to. It still gives me a nightmare until today. But two things I want to add here. Jess Melvin's book is an excellent book for resource, especially for this particular question of how the army is involved. Not just is involved, they organized this, orchestrated this whole killing, and we haven't mentioned how many people got killed. We actually don't know the exact number, but it's between 500,000 to 3 million people. We don't have the exact number yet. What's really important also from Jess Melvin is that the army actually, the reason why it can be orchestrated in such a systematic, expansive, organized way is because the army already possessed this institutional machinery through Kodam. Kodam is the territorial command structure. What is the territorial command structure? The military basically had already created organization parallel to government organization from Jakarta down to the provincial, to the city, to the village level. And this is why they already have existing chains of command that then they use to send orders, intelligence, propaganda, arrests, and killings to be then coordinated nationally. Another thing that needs to be emphasized also, Suharto was nobody, right? Yes, he is the leader of Kostrad, but he used the vacuum that's created by the kidnapping and the murder of senior generals to then take over control. And then there was actually new evidence to in Jess Melvin's book that shows he immediately communicated with regional commanders and issued instructions independently of Sukarno, right? So this just makes us feel like they probably have already prepared this coup as well. This is just, they basically, okay, we already have this plan, the design or is already there. Also, the call for annihilation, and I want all of us to just remember that the call for annihilation, penumpasan ke akar-akarnya, annihilate down to the roots. That call was made on the night of October 1st. So within 24 hours, the military commander Ahmad Mokoginta immediately instructed their forces to do this annihilation. So it's very clear that this systematic extermination had been planned all along. So, and I really like that Melvin actually provocatively, invites us to change, instead of calling it G30 SPKI, the 30th September movement of PKI, we should change it to G30 S Militer, the 30th September movement of the military, because really it's the military who used that movement as a catalyst, as a pretext to take over the state, essentially. The second thing that we need to put on the table is that the PKI was not just be a victim passively and just sit there. We should not forget, they did not just, simply vanish, but rather the surviving cadres, they actually tried to regroup. And most famously in South Blitar in East Java, and they fought back in 1967. Of course, the PKI was really small by then. These are like some surviving members. They realized that, the parliamentary road had failed. And so they began experimenting with clandestine organization and even armed struggle. But once again, even though this fighting back was very isolated and small, it vindicated the military to say that, see, the PKI, the communists, was really monstrous. We need to kill them. And so it become even more, it justifies more anti-communist propaganda and more killing.
What I think we need to think about is the fact that, Sukarno was very strong. And he had a lot of support within regional governments. He had a lot of support within the military, especially within the Air Force and the Navy. And those branches are the ones that had the most advanced weaponry, right? because they were the ones who had gotten a lot of the weapons from the Soviet Union, for instance. I think it's very clear that it is a move by the military to stun not just the PKI but also Sukarno, and to sort of reduce his power significantly by providing this sort of massive sort of counterinsurgency approach that nobody really expected to be on this level. And I think probably they consider that it could only happen at that level. Had it been slower, Sukarno might have been able to regroup, and he still had some legitimacy going up to 1966, but although he slowly lose his power, and he was still trying to protect the PKI and protect other part of the coalition. He was still trying to maintain that three-pronged structure between the army, himself, and the PKI, but he lost that. And I think so in that case, I think the sheer scale of it was necessary by the army. They saw it as necessary to provide that kind of psyop or the kind of sort of traumatic punch that made Sukarno lost his control. Just remember, just in 1965, just earlier, there was this large anniversary of the PKI, right? There was might have been 100,000 people in Jakarta celebrating that with Sukarno and the head of the PKI there. So the idea that the PKI could be destroyed in 1 year would have been ludicrous to a lot of people. But the fact that it was able to do that, and I think that also goes in line with the kind of counterinsurgency ideas that the army had, as Made has discussed, has honed in during the 50s and 60s in West Java during the DITI problems, and then also with the confrontasi. But a lot of this, they had learned it from the US as well, or from the kind of education that they had gained in US military institutions. And then they applied it, because I don't think this has ever happened before in Indonesia. It didn't happen during the Dutch colonial period in the kind of scale that was, and the kind of sort of large participatory sort of way in which they managed to force people, neighbors, sometimes brothers within one family to participate in the killing, or to participate or to sort of implicate people with the crime. That kind of thing is very modern. It's counterinsurgency at the level that is really much more at the context of military thinking, global military thinking, the 50s and 60s with the psyops and so forth. So it's something which surprised a lot of people in Indonesia, I think. And that's just the level, the scale, and the brutality of it, and the way in which they implicate people in Indonesia with it. So you actually create this kind of, either you're with us or against us. There is no middle ground. So whether you're the evil communist or you're part of Indonesian society. And I mean, despite all of the, it's amazing how brilliant they applied it. You have to actually give them some respect in that context of how brilliant they've really shifted the Indonesian nation fundamentally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do we know about U.S. involvement in and support for Suharto's coup and for the campaign of mass murder that followed? Because we don't know everything. There are still classified documents, but we do know enough to say that that not only was the U.S. enthusiastic about the coup and the mass murder, but that it actively and materially supported the killings. What do we know? What remains unknown? And what made the administration of U.S. President Lyndon Johnson and the CIA so willing to engage in such mass atrocities?
For this question, I would bring two books: Bradley Simpson's Economists with Guns and Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method. And Simpson actually is useful because he moves beyond the narrow question of did the CIA support the coup, and instead he asks why U.S. policymakers wanted a military victory over Sukarno and the PKI in the first place. So we don't, like as you said, then we don't know much about what the U.S. involvement. But in general, historians agree that the U.S. welcomed the destruction of the PKI. They encouraged the anti-PKI forces. They provided material assistance to the Indonesian army, and viewed the army's victory as a actually major Cold War success. Let's start with what it was at stake for Washington. Remember, by the early 1960s, Indonesia had become one of the most important countries in the global south, right? It was the world's fifth most populous country, strategically located between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, very rich in oil, rubber, tin, and other resources, and also home to the world's largest communist party outside the Soviet Union and China. And so the US policymakers became afraid of Sukarno's anti-imperialism and also the growth of the PKI. And then later in the 60s, especially Indonesia's close relationship with China. They're afraid of the possibility that Indonesia might become a model for radical third world nationalism. So according to Simpson, US officials saw Indonesia as one of the most important battleground, right, of the Cold War. So the Indonesian army was the only force that's actually capable of preventing this leftward transformation of the country. So in essence, the US, and this is one of his important findings, the US had been preparing for an army PKI confrontation for years. So the US was not actually just simply reacting to October 6, 1965. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, US officials had cultivated relationships with army officers. They've expanded, as I think, was it Abi or Made who mentioned this, but they expanded military training programs. They provided military assistance and increasingly viewed the army as this modernizing anti-communist force. And this strategy emerged especially after the failure of the CIA-backed PRRI Permesta rebellion that we talk about, right? So rather than supporting the regional rebels, this time the Washington became more invested in the Central Army leadership. So what happened after October the 1st is that the army moved against the PKI and the US officials reacted with enthusiasm. US officials provided communications equipment to the military, shared intelligence. They assisted army information campaigns. And actually, one of the best documented examples is the provision of lists of suspected PKI leaders and activists that's shared to the Indonesian army. So the US and its allies basically aided and abetted the campaign against the PKI. But did the US support the killing? Well, yes. Historians, I don't think the historians would argue that Washington ordered the massacres. So the US did support the killing, but they did not, it's still the Indonesian army that conceived, directed, and carried out the campaign. However, we know that US officials knew mass killing was occurring. They welcome it as a political victory, right? Essentially for scholars, the United States was not just a passive observer in this case. Now, how about Bevin's Jakarta method? He gave us a much broader global framework. He asked, how did Indonesia become a model for a global anti-communist project? So he basically strengthened the argument about US responsibility, right? But it's not just simply about the United States welcoming the killing or supporting the army or supplying intelligence. His argument is more that Indonesia became one of the most successful anti-communist operations of the Cold War and was then subsequently celebrated within parts of the US national security establishment. And I think one of his important contributions from his Jakarta method is that Jakarta, this word, became an international anti-communist symbol. In Latin America, for example, anti-communist activists and military officers, they would threaten leftists with phrases like, Jakarta is coming, or do a Jakarta. So in other words, Indonesia was not just merely another Cold War intervention. Indonesia became a model.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little to that. But on another level, I think what's another aspect which America sort of supports in the context of the emergence of the new order is ideological, actually, because in a sense, this idea of modernization theory, and in Indonesian called pembangunan, that's sort of the ideological base for the new order. So the new order, as a corporatist political concept, looks at the role of the state and the role of the army as a modernizing group. And this kind of ideology was developed in part through soldiers going into to get their training in the U.S., but also economists and social scientists trained in the U.S. going back to Indonesia, who sort of crafted this model of pembangunan. And it created another future vision for the nation that is very dissimilar to Sukarno's global revolution. In this case, society's well-being should be based on a managerial group of people who are rational, who are competent, and actually that image of competence and rationality falls into the military, the army officer. And, of course, it started at its roots during the takeover of Dutch-owned companies in 1957. But by 1965, this idea that the military or the army people, nowadays it seems quite strange, but at that time, as being the most rational part of society, that had become sort of legitimated takeover of the army and of the military, of the state, and of their sort of control of society itself. So, but that's not a direct help, but in a sense, the kind of educational help that the U.S. provided both to the army and to the economists and other elite members, social scientists in Indonesia, they provided the ideological basis for this transition.
Yeah, I think I agree with Abe. Actually, this is a part of the process that the United States has been prepared before by training some section. I think not some section, but most of the section of the military. All of the military elites were trained, and then I think they have a vision for Indonesian future, which is modern and then capitalistic, based on market or something like that. And then also the economists, and you see that soon after Suharto is in power, he hired what they call it the Berkeley Mafia, and then some U.S. scientist, I forgot his name, even called Indonesia as a fourth nation, because a lot of these economists, technocrats, and social scientists was given scholarships by Ford, the Ford country. Ford Foundation gave a lot of scholarship for these Indonesian social scientists, technocrats, and economists. The late foundation for modernizing Indonesia, making it a market suitable for capitalistic development. And then, of course, there's also an issues on the human rights side that the U.S. also conducted studies before on the Indonesian Communist Party, and then the U.S. embassy has. This is unproven until now. We never seen the document that the U.S. Supply the names of the name of the elites of the Communist Party in Indonesia, and it's become the base for the military to detain them, and then to some of them to kill them. This kind of thing. So the U.S. actually deeply involved in this process, not only during the operation day, but also before that, by laying the foundations of for the subsections of Indonesian political society, train them and give them ideology and laid foundation for the market capitalistic development.
China was blamed for the purported coup attempt, and Chinese Indonesians were also targeted in the mass killings. Why was that? Was that based on these long-standing animosities against Chinese people due to their peculiar intermediary economic position, a position that as we've discussed, dates back to the colonial period, or did it have to do more with the PKI, Sukarno, and the Chinese diaspora's relationships with the Chinese Communist Party at the time, or all of the above?
I think it's because of the access of Jakarta, Beijing, and Pyongyang at the time. That's become that Sukarno made new emerging forces. That's what he called it. So this kind of alliance between Indonesia, North Korea, and China, I think that's Sukarno's answer to the geopolitical situation at that time. That's why the Chinese were targeted, and then only China can provide was agreed to arm the fifth forces for the Communist Party at the time. So I think that's very reasonable that American trained generals are very, very worried about this, that they have a competitor from the workers and the peasants who are armed by the Chinese weaponry. So that's what they're afraid of. But regarding to the Chinese Indonesian, I think it's not as severe as the violence. I think not as severe as later on during the New Order, where the violence become routine. Yeah, because within the New Order itself, there's a lot of, I think since the very beginning, a lot of Chinese Indonesians was also becoming part of the New Order. For example, the Catholics, a lot of Chinese Indonesian Catholics, for example, like the family of Wanandi, Sofian Wanandi and Yusuf Wanandi, who later on established the CSIS in Jakarta. And this is part of and also some of them are becoming the OPSUS, the special intelligence within the New Order, and also laid the foundation to creating Golkar and etc. I think a lot of Chinese involvement in here, and also the business partner of Suharto, also mostly Chinese. So I think Chinese has not a singular role in here. They are targeted, of course, by the people at the grassroots level everywhere. The animosity toward Chinese were there before, since the colonial time, but the time they exploded into violence. I think it really being controlled by the regime, by the military, and it's become routine. I think. When something happens, like if this time in Indonesia right now, we have the financial crisis, I think the first thing that the government or the military did during the New Order was just targeting the Chinese, blaming to the Chinese. So right now, I think because of the changes in Indonesians, changes in the Chinese society, that idea blaming the Chinese is not really popular among the masses. But I think it could be popular again if some sections of this government want to exploit it, because the animosity is still there. Yeah.
Yeah, the Chinese in Indonesia is not a monolith, I think, as Mada has explained. So I don't think there is a particular point in which people say, oh, Chinese are communist, period, because because they occupy a lot of positions in society. But also anti-Chinese violence have occurred since the revolutionary period. And in fact, in 1958, there was an effort by the government to expel the Chinese from the countryside. And then in 1960, they were forced to determine whether they want to become Indonesian or not. And around 100,000 Chinese Indonesian decided or opted to become Chinese citizens, and they left for China. So the Chinese communist state sent boats to repatriate these people, a lot of them having been living in Indonesia since the 19th century. Also, another thing is that unlike, for instance, in Malaysia or Singapore, where the Communist Party is a Chinese party to an extent, Indonesian Communist Party had always been a very indigenous party, right? Because remember, Indonesia's Communist Party was the first Communist Party in Asia, predating the Communist Party in China, and so there was never any doubt that it was an Indonesian party. We have to then also think about the fact that most victims are Indonesians. Most of them are actually Javanese farmers, and they take up the vast majority of the people that are being killed. Javanese also take up quite a number of people in the communist ranks at the elite level. So, for instance, the Communist Party in Malaya has a position that they are sort of foreign, but whereas the Communist Party in Indonesia has always been local. It's always been so. That's why the new order, the army had to dehumanize the Communist Party, make them non-Indonesian in a sense, right? Because they had such a strong legitimacy, being one of the original parties for a national party for Indonesia since the early 20th century. There are definitely parts of that is racism towards the Chinese. There's a long history of Indonesian racism towards the Chinese, especially because of their position in colonial society. And this middle position has always been used by the state, the colonial state, and then the independent state to use the Chinese as scapegoats. So the Chinese have always been used as scapegoats in which they would let native anger towards this foreign element instead of towards the government, for instance.
The killings took place while Sukarno was still technically president. How did Suharto seize control in the sort of slow way that he did? I mean, in some sense, he immediately seized control, but then officially it was more gradual. How did this transpire, this passage from Suharto effectively taking power to him officially deposing Sukarno and becoming the leader for 3 decades of the New Order dictatorship?
So Suharto did not seize power in a single coup. He seized it incrementally. So the first stage was this military control that we have discussed, right? Not formal political control. He took over command of the army by October 1st, and then he controlled the troops, communications, and the coercive apparatus of the state. But Sukarno at this time remained president and still formally possessed the constitutional authority. But at the same time, Suharto actually avoided openly overthrowing Sukarno. He knew, and I think Mada and Abi has mentioned this, Sukarno was still very popular at this time. Many Indonesians actually were very loyal to him. So a direct coup against him is risky, right? So what Suharto did instead was systematically strip Sukarno of power, while preserving his the symbolic position by banning PKI, right? By removing Sukarno's allies. And then also by encouraging anti-Sukarno demonstrations, students actually led anti-Sukarno demonstrations. And also then the army then steadily took over the state institution. But one thing that's very important, again, I say this because we all studied this, or as a child, right? We talk about this every year. There is this thing called the Super Semar, which is the Surat Perintah 11 Maret, the 11th March Order of March 11th, 1966. So amidst this political crisis and chaos and this military pressure, Sukarno signed a document authorizing Suharto to take whatever measures necessary to restore order and protect the government. What actually exactly happened during that time was actually still very controversial. Some people who witnesses actually said that Sukarno was signing it under coercive condition. And this is what's really important then. Nobody has ever seen the original document. Where is that document that's signed by Sukarno, which hasn't been publicly produced, right? But we celebrate March 11 every year. It's nuts. But anyway, so Suharto immediately interpreted this Super Semar as a transfer of political authority. Within days, he banned PKI, he arrested leading ministers who were loyal to Sukarno, and he expanded his authority far beyond what Sukarno may have intended. Then what we see, Sukarno was politically isolated, right? He tried to defend himself through speeches, like the Nawaksara, but the army really controlled the political arena. By 67, he remained president only in name, but not in reality. And then by 68, Suharto was formally elected president, right? So this is like a slow motion coup. Military power first, and then constitutional authority came later. Basically, the destruction of the PKI and the broader left was inseparable from this transfer of power. And that Suharto's rise is basically portrayed as a constitutional restoration, right, and stabilization. And something else I think that's also important to note is that the new order in this case have been throughout its 32 years portraying itself as rescuing Indonesia, rescuing the nation from chaos and returning us to the true constitution of 45. And so this narrative helped to legitimize both the destruction of PKI and Suharto's assumption of power.
Before we get into the New Order regime, we should cover just an important basic here. Who was Suharto? How did he rise through the ranks of the KNIL, through the Japanese PETA, the Republican Army, to the top of Kostrad? How did he rise to the point where he was in the position to seize absolute power?
Suharto is Javanese, originally from Yogyakarta, but then after he, I think, entered the elementary school, he moved to Central Java in Pracimantoro, is in Wonogiri Regency in Central Java near Solo. And he graduated in a middle school, I think the lower middle school, and then he, I think at this, he wants to be a banker actually. So after the graduating from middle school, he worked for a while in a bank, a small bank, very, very small bank, a rural bank actually. And then after that, he entered the Netherlands Indies, army, but for a short while, and then the Japanese came in, the Japanese occupiers, and then he joined PETA, the famous Japanese militia. I think, but he is just ordinary soldiers at the time until the revolutions, and he becomes middle rank officers. He was in charge to launch operations, seizing Yogyakarta in order to show to the world that Indonesia still exists. And then after that, he becomes, his rank is going up. While in Yogyakarta, I think since the very beginning, he was very interested in the leftist ideology. While in Yogyakarta, he has some mentor here where he becomes quote-unquote socialist. And until he becomes the commanders of the Diponegoro unit, this is the Kodam or provincial level of the military units. He still has, I think, all of the people who conducted the coup in '65 were his subordinates, Latif, Untung, etc. A lot of them. So they are very leftist army officers. But also, Suharto is also very pragmatic, since he was, as you know, that during that era in the 50s, 55 onwards, all of the military commanders in the regions is also the local warlords. He was involved in smuggling business. He opened an account in Singapore in order to some of it to fund his own unit, his own military unit, but some of them he pocketed himself. So I know that Suharto has a bank account in 60, I think it's 66, 65, 66. Yeah, when he asked Yusuf Wanandi to go to Papua and saw the dire situation over there because of Indonesian occupation. So Yusuf Wanandi was ordered to buy foods and all supplies and withdraw money from Suharto's bank account, 17 million US dollars at that time. You remember, you can imagine that. This is in 1967. So Suharto has already collected that amount of money and put it in the Singaporean bank. So he already had a business partner named Lim Shuliong at that time, who was in I think living in Rembang or Kudus, around that city, very close to Semarang, where he was stationed, until Nasution knows that he was very corrupt. Nasution was very angry and then fired him and sent him to school at the school staff and command in Bandung for 1 year, and then he become the. Actually, not so many people realize that Kostrad, Indonesian strategic reserve, was a very strategic part of the army at the time, because below Kostrad there's a RPKAD, which is a special forces, and he also controlled that. So, but because he was a left-leaning, he was seen by his former subordinates are not so dangerous, and he has no hope actually before 65. He said that he will retire soon. He was being the commander of Kostrad. He has no work to do. He go fishing all the time. He likes fishing. Yeah, he go fishing all the time. And then, but boom! Suddenly, 1965 bring something new to him, and he saw this an opportunity, and he used it. Yeah, and actually, he was reluctant at first to take over the power, but then after that, he was surrounded by very ambitious officers, people like Ali Murtopo, for example, his chief intelligence, and Sujono Humardani, his chief intelligence and economist, which also have the civilian counterparts. Yeah, Ali Murtopo works a lot with the students, and Sujono Humardani work a lot with the Japanese businesses. Then this convinced Suharto that he can do something. And also he was convinced by a lot of support from technocrats and also from Indonesian social scientists, economists, and some sections. So he knows that this is the chance for him to be in power, to take control. And he was not an ambitious man. He always not. I think I should mention it. As a Japanese, he didn't show his ambition. Of course, he is ambitious man, no doubt about that. But he didn't show it as a Japanese. And as you know, that the Japanese always acting slowly, very very refined in his acting, but at the same time also very brutal and cruel. So it's a lot of people call him a smiling general, but inside the smiling general is there's also a brutal side of him, a very Machiavellian, if you want to say that, very on purpose, and very very good at playing the balance between cruelty and what is it, a civilized manner. That's Suharto.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig. my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing. And if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Pluto Press, the independent radical publisher. A new book of Pluto's you might like is Backlash, The Global Rise of the Radical Right, edited by Don Kolb and Walden Bellow. As leftists, we often find ourselves predicting the future. Unfortunately, capital's predicted slide into fascism is now well underway. Here, two preeminent Marxists collect a wealth of historical materialist analyses on the rise of fascism across the world, from countries including India, Russia, Argentina, Ukraine, South Africa, and many more. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50, that's DIG50, at plutobooks.com. Benedict Anderson argues that the coup and Suharto's regime, that it all essentially represented a reassertion of the state over society, over Indonesian society and the new nation that Indonesian society was struggling to bring into existence. And it was the military here, empowered, internally cohered, secured against political party interference, in possession of its own economic resources. All of these developments that we've been discussing in recent interviews, it was this military that through the coup and the mass killings, in essence, asserted itself as the state. And looking back at the years leading up to the coup, the military had already begun to make itself indistinguishable from the state through the doctrine of dual function, or dwifungsi, which established the central role for the military in politics and society and in the economy. And this was a system that came about under Sukarno initially. Then there was Golkar, which had been a container for these so-called functional groups like the military under guided democracy, but then under Suharto became the official military state political party. Looking at all this military government integration established under Sukarno, dual function, Kodam, which is territorial command, as we've discussed, and then Golkar, looking at all of that and more, to what extent can we see the very concrete institutional outlines of New Order taking shape within Sukarno's Indonesia?
I think that's a little bit different on that, Dan, because of the way that I saw it, the New Order that I experienced in the first 32 years of my life, actually, because I was born in early in 66. I only knew one president for the first 32 years of my life. This system was created by a lot of things, but I think the backbone of this, I would say, is the Holy Trinity. One is the military, the second is the bureaucracy, and the third is the political party. This all has a bureaucracy inside it. The military bureaucracy was overlapped with the civilian bureaucracy. From the top to the bottom, to the village, even to the village level. And then there's a Golkar, the political party, which has also the similar organization parallel to this. So you have three dimensions who was to control the society from the top to the bottom. So you can't do anything. And also it incorporated the Japanese occupation organization that the Japanese itself no longer use it, which is called Tonarigumi, which is rukun tetangga and rukun warga. This is the smaller unit of the society, a couple of families, and it's become the rukun tetangga. I don't know what is in English. This is a neighborhood association. They control it. Every neighborhood association has their own chairman, and then these chairmen, several of these chairmen become the rukun warga. On top of that, and this is and then above that, the village level. So you have this kind of structures. They control everything. Of course, it is also at the same. One is to become a control and command. But the second thing is it's a very effective tool for development, economic development, and also is a very effective tool for distributing welfare, for example. All of the system is still in place, and even until now. So, whoever wants to come to power in Indonesia, they have to manage this kind of structure. So, in the difference is that during the Suharto's time, everything was commanded through the military, to the dual function, because the military acted as not only they control Golkar as a civilian arms, but they also have their own political agenda. And Golkar has to follow the military. Even though close to the end of the Suharto's era, Golkar tried to distance itself a little bit from the military. It's not controlled because Suharto also cannot control the military, fully control the military. So he has to control something. And then Golkar is trying to be independent, even though not 100% independent, probably 70% are independent from the military. But this kind of structures give the stability to Indonesia. And then Suharto also knows that he reorganized the central and regional relations. Yeah, he he incorporate all of the local elites into the system, putting them in the Golkar functionaries, a local businessman, a local strong people, and everything. And then also he's not forget about all of the remnants of the kingdoms in Indonesia, all of this. They give it a spacious place for like a tourism project or something like that. So give money to them, and they are also happy. So he's just very, very good at managing all of these structures. So I think that's why he can exist for 32 years, a very, very long time in a stable situation. The thing is start to changing in early 90s when he started, because he's staying for too long, and he didn't build a system not like Lee Kuan Yew PAP in Singapore, who then have a marriage system. But when he increasingly becoming old and he doesn't trust a lot of people, he start to build his own system, his own structure. He start to be nepotistic. He start to putting his son in and his daughter in a business, and it ruins the structures.
I think we can sort of see the outline of the New Order state emerging in the context of guided democracy. For one thing, for instance, the role of the army. If you look at the number of governors that are from the army during the Sukarno period is actually higher than than afterwards during the early New Order period. So Sukarno was not. Sukarno supported this expansion of army participation as part of the major pillar of guided democracy. And as you've said, that there are a lot of the basic institutions that would then be the basis of the New Order state emerged during the guided democracy. So there's a lot to be said that there's a continuation institutionally between the guided democracy and the New Order. But of course, Sukarno didn't envision it purely as, I think what's the main difference is ideological in that sense. Because Sukarno's ideology sort of seen the state as promoting his revolutionary goals. But Suharto's ideology is of course, about developmentalism, about integrating Indonesia's economy into the Western world. Suharto was a pragmatic. I don't think he was ideological. I think he was never very ideological. He was quite, as Limade said, a Machiavellian figure. He was also very Javanese. He doesn't show any form of enthusiasm. So the idea of the smiling general was actually to say that you don't know what's behind his thought. So if something is bad is happening, he would smile. If something good is happening, he would smile. So this sort of Javanese mask over his face, because you don't know his internal thought, and that's very important for Javanese people. It's part of the action of power is to show calmness. So if you're in power, you're calm all the time, despite the conditions. So I think probably Suharto was very ambitious, but he would never show it. It would be very un-Javanese for him to be excited. Being excited would be very the worst thing you can do as a Javanese powerful man, for instance. And as Blimade has said, he was very opportunist. So in that sense, he saw the option. I don't think he ever let go of the potential for being in power. He was very much into that, and when he saw an opening, he took it. But the fact that he looked unambitious, he was very much an unremarkable person. That actually helped him, because a lot of people didn't see him as, in the military, in the army, very few people saw him as a rival, including Nasution, who was surprised that Suharto would take over the state, actually. Nobody in the army thought that this was the guy who would take over the state. So his unremarkableness helped that. But again, and then also during his stint, so after he was involved in corruption, and then he lost his position at the Kodam in Semarang, and then he went to Sesquad. Now, during his stint in Sesquad, he began meeting with a lot of these new minted economists who would become his technocrats, and they discussed a lot of things about a new vision of developmentalism. So I think the roots of his ideology came during his stint in Sesquad and his meeting with his future technocrats, especially with Nugrono to Susanto, who taught there regularly with all the army officers. Yeah, but I think it's really important that the New Order did not start, in a sense, in 1965-66, that it had its roots as part of, ironically, Sukarno's revolutionary guided democracy experiment.
Yeah. I think it would be helpful to refer to what Dan mentioned, Ben Anderson's article, right? On how the military asserted itself as the state. So yes, it's right that the New Order didn't come out of the blue in 65. And also the New Order was not simply a change of government, right? It's a victory of an increasingly autonomous state apparatus over the social forces that's unleashed by the revolution. So in some ways, you could read it from Hegel's perspective of, the movement of the particular to the general, in a sense that this was a particular institution that then claimed to be the dominant, or in Gramscian term, from the emergent into the dominant. But remember, all of those is also something historically contingent, right? There's a historical contingency in here in a way that, after the revolution unleashed mass politics on an unprecedented scale. The 50s and the early 60s were the most politically mobilized period in Indonesian history. And we haven't had that again now, today. Workers, peasants, youth, women, religious groups, parties, unions, and social movements all entered political life. Sukarno tried to manage this through guided democracy. Like Nasacom, for example, was actually an attempt to contain the social conflict by balancing competing forces, the PKI, nationalist groups, Islamic organization, and the military. But remember, the military was different from the parties. They were not just political actor. They possessed weapons, territorial organization, administrative authority, intelligence networks, and increasingly its own economic resources. So essentially, Sukarno helped build the military, helped strengthen the military through a lot of his decisions. The regional rebellions of the 50s, that strengthened the army. Martial law strengthened the army. Nationalization of Dutch enterprises strengthened the army. West Irian, confrontasi, all of them strengthened the army. We have discussed the territorial command, we've discussed Golkar, but essentially the army over time became more internally coherent. So this is what allowed them to essentially, what happened, what we're seeing is the competing social and political forces, PNI, PKI, all of those are political actors. They exhausted one another eventually. While this institution, this military institution, very material, right? Owning material, be it weapon or even economic resources, they claim to stand above politics and they accumulated power.
Suharto, after seizing power, he quickly moved to do what was necessary to get Indonesia on the right side of Western imperialist powers and capitalist interests, including by ending confrontasi and imposing economic liberalization to varying degrees. And the result of this was a huge influx of financial assistance from the US, Europe, Japan, funding that not only allowed Suharto to sufficiently, if only provisionally, resolve Indonesia's economic crisis, but that also enhanced his own and the central state's power domestically. How did Suharto reposition Indonesia within the world capitalist system and in the Cold War-defined geopolitical order? What did it mean geopolitically for the regional and global balance of power for what had been Sukarno's Indonesia to suddenly fall into the U.S. orbit?
Okay, so, Indonesia shifting to the Western fold was not actually automatic. There was, in 65, 66, there was a lot of bad blood between a lot of Western governments and the capitalist West towards Indonesia because of their nationalization policy under Sukarno, right, in 57, and then in the 60s during the confrontasi period where American and British assets were taken over. So Suharto and his technocratic teams, they went on full blitz to the West. They went to Washington, they went to Tokyo, they went to Amsterdam, and they started courting Western policymakers, but also Western companies. In 1967, there was a meeting in Amsterdam which would result in the formation of what's called the Intergovernmental IGGI, I forgot the full term of that, the Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia. That became sort of the vehicle for Western aid to Indonesia. And in 1968, Robert McNamara, which had just become the head of the World Bank, visited Jakarta. And a year later, they actually opened the first country chapter in the world in Jakarta. And it was the biggest country chapter. So I think what's important is that when McNamara and the World Bank team went to Jakarta, they were enamored by Suharto and by the technocrats. So Suharto and the technocrats were able to sell the promise that Indonesia was to become this major win for Western capitalism. And as a result of that, since the formation of IGGI and the formation of the World Bank country chapter in Jakarta and the IMF branch in Jakarta, there was a steady stream of aid to the tune of up to $40 billion by the early 90s. So there was no problem. I mean, if you think about Sukarno and the fact that he accumulated some $1.5 billion of debt, which couldn't be repaid, Suharto was being given $2 billion on average every year up to the 90s. And so there was a significant financial aid to the New Order state. And primarily, I think this is because, exactly as you said, Dan, Indonesia was the poster child. How do you recreate a revolutionary state that was anti-Western, anti-imperialist, that fashioned itself as the leader of the global South into this compliant poster child for development. And in 1992, the World Bank gave Indonesia a standing ovation as part of the Asian miracle economy, just a couple of years before the economy collapsed because of corruption, of course. But as a way to show the world, this is what the West offers, right? So the destruction of the communism was the stick, but the development was the carrot. In 1967, also, I think the Indonesian government set up this meeting with around 50 of the largest multinational corporation in the world in Geneva. It was supported by the Time Corporation from the US. And there, the technocrats went and met with a whole group of people who represented these major multinational corporations, and then asked them, what do you guys need so that you want to come into the country? And in Geneva, they sort of hammered in the Indonesian foreign investment law. So the Indonesian foreign investment law was created not by Indonesians in Jakarta, but by a group of multinational corporate executives in Geneva in cooperation with Indonesian technocrats. So by the 70s, Indonesia was wide open for investments. And in fact, for instance, in the oil sector, it was one of the most active investment place in the world at the time. And you could see that, for instance, in the expanding income of oil. For instance, Pertamina, the Indonesian national company, by the early 60s became the largest corporation in Asia outside of Japan, actually, just because of just the amount of investments from the West. But during that time of meeting with the multinational corporations, they also sort of divided Indonesians. It was a big feast, sort of like the African division. What is that during the Berlin conference? In that sense, you get the Freeport gets the what do you call that? The copper in Papua, which apparently isn't just copper, but it's actually the biggest gold mountain on the planet, which a lot of it was then taken without being told by the Indonesian government. A lot of the golds were just being transferred to I think Louisiana is where Freeport comes from. And then, the nickel mines was given to a Canadian company called Inco. So all of Indonesia's major national resources were just being given one by one to multinational corporations. So it was a success in that sense. And, but at the same time, it was a complete ravaging of Indonesia's natural resources. It was a complete sort of selling out of these kind of resources that are non-renewable, right? So, but that became sort of the basis. So both multilateral aid from various countries. The biggest was actually from America and Japan. Japan was actually one of the major beneficiary of Indonesia's opening up. For instance, Indonesia became the primary market for Japanese cars, for Japanese products. Even just recently, 90% of all cars in Indonesia are Japanese, basically. If you go to Indonesian city, all you see are Japanese cars everywhere. So for a long time, Indonesia became just a market for Japanese products. So in that sense, the integration of Indonesia into the world economy was on the term of the imperialist. And so it sort of cemented our position as provider of raw material, of natural resources, and so forth. And although there were efforts for industrialization, that has not been successful so far, even up to the present period.
We should really emphasize here the just dramatic intensification of the exploitation, really looting of Indonesian natural resources, forests, mines, fisheries, that continues to this day as really fundamental to New Order.
Yeah, so I guess what the New Order has created is this perfect system for investment and extraction. The 1965-66 killing traumatized Indonesian society and civil society to an extent that there was very few resistance to the extraction and to the sort of imposition of foreign companies into just even the deepest parts of of the country, especially within the islands outside of Java, where they had for a long time been under military operations, and now it's a combination of military and capitalist exploitation. In many cases, the military protects these companies. So even up till today, the Freeport mines is a military operation as well as a capitalist operation. The gas and oil fields in Aceh, in Kalimantan, they were supported by consistent military presence to deter any form of engagement by the local people. So it was very much a military come capitalist extractive structure that had its roots in the colonial period, but it's really also really you can see that as a result of the expansion of the military during the guided democracy period and afterwards.
Can I just add something very short, because Abi ended with Freeport. Just FYI, Freeport McMoran is the first a major foreign investment contract that's signed between with the new order, and they also shape Indonesia's new foreign investment regime. How? Freeport lawyers sat in and helped draft Indonesia's 1967 foreign investment law. I mean, it's like the reassertion of Indonesian political economy to the global capitalism was actually, basically catered and accompanied hand in hand with the U.S. and allies.
Yeah, so that I know that Freeport was given contract in 1967, 2 years before the Act of Free Choice held by. Formally, it's not Indonesian territory yet, because the Act of Free Choice was conducted 2 years after that. But I think in terms of the political economy, you have to see that the new order is a contrast state or counter-revolutionary state. So it's It's erased all of what's going on in the republic since the early 20th century, the nationalism and everything, and rewritten it into colonialist modes during the end of 19th century, when the Dutch creating the agrarian law and opening the Dutch East Indies into foreign direct investment. That's all. I think it's a counter-revolutionary state, and I think a lot of Indonesia. Sure, Indonesia is very rich in natural resources, and all that becomes the capital of Indonesia, and that's also explained why Indonesia until now becomes a satellite state. It's not the central state because it never industrialized. Yeah, it's relied too much on natural resources. Right now, before it was forest and then oil and gas, and now it's palm oil and nickel and everything. It will never become industrial states. And I think to give you a perspective, I was invited by a group of students from East Kalimantan the other day. And I said to them, look, in early 70s or in the 60s, you guys have forest, right? You have forest. Where's the forest right now? It's gone. It's replaced by palm oil. And then you have oil and gas. It is still there. And then you have coal. Every day, 200,000 tons coals were bring out from East Kalimantan every day. And what did you get? What are you getting right now? Your human development index is still weak. Your poverty rate is not improving. What if you have all of these things and you live without Jakarta? Can you imagine that if you're not living with Jakarta? You are more affluent than Brunei Darussalam because you have all of things. This is exemplify how Jakarta plunders everything for all over Indonesia, especially outside Java. And in Java, it use human resources that the Java has. A lot of human here, they can be workers and soldiers and or the civil servants, something like that. So transfer it to outside Java. So this kind of things, I think, is anti-revolutionary and a capitalist development, but it's a very, very dependent state or satellite state, whatever you can call it. It will never become an industrial state, can never become a country like Singapore because of we have a problem with Jakarta, with the elites. This is the central tenets of the New Order, I think. It's the plundering the natural resources in order to create a capitalist development, but it's going nowhere.
How did this New Order political economy that we've been discussing, how did it organize domestic class and power relations, the domestic class and power structure? What sort of ruling class did it nurture or create? Corruption, it became extraordinarily widespread, including with Suharto himself, his relatives, favored capitalists, military officials, all using their position to steal huge sums of money. And then there was the particular role played by Chinese Indonesian capitalists under Suharto, known as Cukong, a peculiar role, even as it drew on the historically peculiar position of Chinese Indonesians. Suharto elevated Chinese Indonesian businessmen to the highest economic positions at the expense of ordinary Indonesians and also the indigenous Indonesian business class, even as the New Order regime encouraged strong anti-Chinese sentiment and very severely repressed Chinese culture and political power. So they were rich, but had no social or political power, keeping them entirely dependent upon Suharto. So what generally was the power and class structure under the New Order in general, and then specifically in terms of Chinese Indonesians?
The New Order envisioned society, as we talked about, in the context of a corporatist state, but that's not actually exactly fully true. I mean, so the idea of the corporatist state or the family state is that the control of the head of the family is total, right? So the father is Suharto in this case, but there's also another form which is called the floating mass idea. And the idea is, of course, how do you depoliticize society? So increasingly in the 70s, under Suharto, there's a lot of repression, reducing political roles in every form of in society. So political parties were controlled and then recreated into just three major parties, the unions, the student groups, which initially a lot of them supported the shift towards the New Order. They also later on in the 70s were depoliticized. So what you had in the New Order society was a hollow society, and then you had the elites, but the elites itself lacked a sort of institutionalized structure. So what you had was Suharto almost as a sultan, and then you had people around him in which he gives favor to. So this structure requires everyone else to be under him and requires a sort of series of coalition under him. So it's almost like a feudal state in a sense in which people near to Suharto or coalitions would obtain something from the state. And so it was very important for Suharto to reduce any form of alternative leadership in Indonesia, right? So the elite was very much under him, and for instance, any military leaders who rose up the ranks, he would, in his own way, reduce their potential to be rival to him. that was also the major reason why the New Order collapsed so spectacularly in 98, is that there was really no mechanism for the transfer of power. So the Suharto's control of power and the centralization was the New Order state in that sense. So there was a lack of sort of institutionalization of power. And then in the context of the Chinese, as you've said, I think that's very true in that Suharto really made a lot of Chukong very powerful. So for instance, Lim Swee Leong, as we've discussed, who he had developed relationship during his period as the head of Kodam in Semarang, he became the richest man in Indonesia. So and this is a very long tradition amongst Javanese leaders in which nobilities develop relations with Chinese traders. So the nobility couldn't, in a way, show themselves fully as traders or as businessmen, but that they work through Chinese, through relationship with Chinese businessmen, Chinese Indonesian businessmen, to make money together. So the Chukongs gave Suharto money, and in return, he provided the kind of environment in which they could rise to become the most important, the largest conglomerates in Indonesia. And the reason why it's also related also to Javanese power dynamics, in that if Suharto gave an Indonesian businessman enough power, he would develop a political base, and so he would then become a threat to his power. So the safest way in which Suharto developed this kind of economy was through empowering middlemen, foreigners, technically Indonesian, of course, which are the Chukongs, which surrounds him. So in a sense, despite all the clamoring of developmentalism and so forth, what Suharto developed was a very fragile structure because it wasn't institutionalized, and it was based more on a kind of one scientist called a franchise. So Suharto gave franchises to people, but that franchises had to be calculated in the context of his power matrix. And so then we can understand why when the New Order collapsed in 98, it collapsed so significantly, because it was never properly institutionalized.
I want to talk about the political economy, just to add that and emphasize how access for US capitalists to Indonesian natural resources was a priority in here. And a lot of the time we don't talk about the environmental devastation that it takes, and which actually is consequential until today. So I just want to make sure that Indonesia, since the New Order regime, right? I mean, even before too, but it fit into the world capitalist system in that Indonesia served to become a supplier of raw material, and a destination for foreign investment. So a lot of what New Order achieved in terms of the development is this forest capital, resource extraction, and cheap labor, and authoritarian political control. And so the consequences, one of the consequences of New Order was actually ecological, because the developmental state, they treated forests, minerals, oil, and land primarily as resources for growth, for development. And hence, these become resources of wealth for these military officers and the oligarchy that Abi has explained before, the military officers, the politically connected businessmen, and the Suharto's family network. And so all of this environmental devastation that we are still experiencing today, from logging, mining, deforestation, extractive industry, all of them actually has roots in the political economic model that's established during the New Order.
I add a little bit. I think I agree with one of the authors. It's a very old book by a Japanese scholar called Yoshihara Kunio, who talk about the ersatz capitalism in Southeast Asia. I think Indonesia is a very good example of that. The ersatz capitalism is pseudo-capitalism, which is it has no technological capitalism with no technological innovations, no independent capitalists, and just rely on natural resources. That's all happened in Indonesia during the New Order and even until now. As you see, if you can get the grasp of the picture of this, is that the Dutch colonial East Indies has the Sumatra. That's its base of economy. The new order has Kalimantan. And now, after the new order, I think Sulawesi and the small island with Naikals, and the next will be Papua. And all of the experience exploitations of natural resources without any technological and innovation. And I think the structure of the new order, the political economy in the new order, I think still intact even until now. Also, the social structure that's supporting it. It's very, very, if you see all of the people who the rich people, they are rich in the new order. You people in power right now, they are in power. They are the sons or the grandsons of the people who were in power in the Suharto's era or benefit. They're coming from the family that the benefiting from the new order. These kind of things, I think, is a continuation. But a lot of Indonesians, especially within the elites, agree that the capitalist development is the only way to get into prosperity for this nation. But I think not so many people are thinking outside of this capitalist development, even though rhetorically, in rhetoric, people are talking about the alternatives, but there's no alternative for this.
Why was the new order so conducive to making Islam and Islamic and Islamist politics ascendant and increasingly fundamentalist currents of Islam at that? We've discussed how conflicts over the role of Islam in society have been central to Indonesian politics since national Indonesian politics really emerged as such in the early 20th century. How did New Order shape the place of Islam in society and the debate over it all? What did the politics of Islam look like once Islamic politics' principal secular opponent, the communists, once they'd been destroyed? And did Islamic politics, relatively unchecked by the New Order state, at least compared to other forms of politics, did that also mean that dissent that once would have been articulated in a communist or secular nationalist register or idiom, that it became Islamicized over time?
I think the first thing that New Order did when it came to power is that treating Islam and communism as the same. It cut their foot in the society and prevented the creation of the Islamic Party that they cannot control. So when Masyumi tried to re-emerge as a Parmusi, as Partai Muslimin in Indonesia, the Suharto's government put a huge limit on them, controlled them tightly, and intervene to elect who can lead this political party. So it's like the communists. It crushed the Islam political field to be big independent mass-based organizations, and then you have for a couple of decades, I think 1 or 2 decades, Islam can do nothing. I think the best that Islam can do is that becoming the civil society organization, aka NGOs. So a lot of Islamic activists that set up NGOs working directly at the grassroots level with a very, very limited independence without being controlled by the military. And then it's in the 90s, it started to move on. I think it started the new movement with the Islamic political society, especially with the help of Saudi financiers from Saudi Arabia because of the geopolitics. So I think at the end of 80s, you see there's some of Islamic groups become so radical. I think at that time, the New Order intelligence know and then it exploded. Before it exploded to a mass movement, it's created conditions, like a small rebellions in Lampung. So a couple of hundreds of people died during that time. Also in Tanjung Priok, a couple of people died. I think at the end of the Benny Murdani's role as the commander of the armed forces. Murdani was a Japanese Catholic, is very loyal to Suharto's. But at the same time, also Murdani has a political ambition, and Suharto knew that. And he tried to eliminate Murdani because a lot of nationalists, especially within the military, was, I think, supporting Murdani to become a vice president, and Suharto felt that it will threaten him. So he get closer to the Islamic community. He set up ICMI, the Muslim intellectual groups led by Habibie, who later become his vice president. But yes, I think in most of the time, Suharto or the New Order has a very ambivalent position toward Islam, but they won't tolerate the independent and then Islamic political organizations.
This is also the New Order era. Also, in the New Order era, there emerged what Bob Hefner called the civil Islam, right? Suharto wanted a loyal Islam that is loyal to the regime, right? They don't want democratic Islam. But during this time also, despite the repression of Islamic revival, we have actually this Islamic revival, education, urbanization, da'wah networks, student movements, the expansion of the Muslim middle class. And through this revival, it was not just simply fundamentalists. There were also, many of them were democratic, pluralists, and reformists. People like Nurholis Majid or Abdurrahman Wahid. These people they articulate pluralist civil Islam. And they become actually part of this terrain of struggle against the New Order era. And I think another thing that needs to be mentioned is Suharto repressed political Islam, but also courted it. And there was a lot of restriction against Islamic groups, but there was also movements, still under the name of Islam. A very famous one is the Tanjung Priok massacre that happened in the early 1980s, right? And these people, ulama and kiai, they were protesting against New Order regime's aggressive policies, targeting independent Islamic expression, and especially forcing them to adopt Pancasila as the sole national ideology. But then they were massacred, right? But then by late 80s, and the early 90s, you'll see that Suharto started to cultivate Muslim allies through ICMI, Islamic banking, Muslim courts, Islamic media. And I think Habibie also created, what was the name of the organization? Oh, ICMI, right? Was it Habibie? Yeah, ICMI. So it's really like the struggle is very real. And this also will tell us how after 1998, this Islamic group became among the powerful groups in the movement.
So first of all, I think it's really important to think of Islam not as a monolith again, right? So Islam actually represents, or Muslim in Indonesia represents all of the political wings. So you can find Muslim as right wing, as communist, as so forth, and that's always been the case. But I think what you're getting at then is the specifically highly Islamist, who wants to create a political state, an Islamist political state, which is similar to what the ITI has advocated. They were repressed very much during the Suharto period. So they went underground, and they formed networks within mosques in universities usually, and then they were very much affected first by the things that was occurring in the Middle East, particularly the Iran Revolution in '79, and then of course the rise of sort of a global jihadist movement. So then, as you can see, that's why in the early '80s the state became much more repressive militarily against these people. So the Tanjung Priok massacre, I think in '84, And then in 85, one of the groups actually bombed Borobudur, the Hindu temple. And also another, I'm not sure which year, a group of terrorist Muslim took over a plane, hijacked But remember, these are only a small part of a wider Muslim participation in politics. But the biggest Muslim bloc is, of course, the Muslim churches, Muhammadiyah and NU, and they were within the proper Islamic political party under the Suharto period, the PPP. And these people then in 85, the two churches decided to support the state by saying that by shifting their ideology from Islam to Pancasila. So basically, for the moderate Muslim, they have sort of been taken over by the national ideology instead of maintaining their Islamist position. And these again, and then of course, as Rianne has mentioned, by the 80s, there was an industrialization happening in Indonesia, and that expanded the middle class. And so there was a Muslim middle class that then became also politically powerful. And then you can see that with ICMI and so forth. What's really interesting is that the radical Muslim group after the Suharto period, they regrouped into a political party, several political parties, particularly the PKS. But what's really interesting is that the Islamist parties share of the votes in the post-2000 period was not that different from 1955. So I'm not sure if we can say definitively there is a resurgence of political Islam. There's really no shift in the amount of votes and percentages of votes in the 50s and in the 2000s. So it's just probably the same ratio of people, but that they never really went away. So they were always part of and they're still part of the state and society today.
I want to return to a longer running story that we haven't really addressed sufficiently yet, which is Darul Islam. We talked about Darul Islam a lot earlier in our series, the Islamist rebellion led by Kartosuwiryo that took off during the final years of the revolution after the army's Silwangi division withdrew from West Java under the terms of the Renville Agreement. And listeners will remember they withdrew to Central Java, where they crushed the PKI rebellion at Majun. Anyhow, Darul Islam continued throughout the 50s until 1962, when Kartosuwiryo was captured, sentenced to death, and executed. But Suharto, he revived Darul Islam so as to use the organization to his own ends. Lay out that longer history. How did Darul Islam, from its beginnings during the revolution, expand beyond West Java and continue fighting the Indonesian state into the early 60s? And why and how then did Suharto's intelligence services revive Darul Islam in the late 1970s and early 80s?
So Kartosuwiryo had been a leading Islamist activist associated with Sarekat Islam and later Masyumi. He rejected both Dutch federalism and the secular nationalist republic. After the Renville Agreement and the withdrawal of the Siliwangi division from West Java, he proclaimed the so-called Negara Islam Indonesia, or NII, the state of Indonesian Islam, in 1949. Chiara Formici, who is one of the leading scholars on this topic, she argues that Darul Islam was not simply a rebellion, but it is in fact a competing vision of the Indonesian nation, right? Because Kartosuwiryo, he accepted Indonesian independence, but rejected the ideological foundations of the republic. He envisioned an Islamic state governed by Sharia and justified through jihad. And the movement expanded beyond West Java during the 1950s. Daud Bereh, for example, in Aceh, he joined the NII in 1953 and led the movement there. And then Kahar Muzakkar, he brought South Sulawesi into the movement. Ibnu Hajar, he led a related rebellion in South Kalimantan. The local grievances, they all differed, but all essentially identified with Kartosuwiryo's Islamic State project. And the rebellion, in fact, became one of the Republic's longest internal wars. And Darul Islam was also, it's Arabic word. Darul also means a home, it's this Islamic home, and so they really tried to create an Islamic state during its time. They established courts, taxation systems through zakat, military unit, TII, the Tentara Islam Indonesia, and local administrations. And in some areas, it controlled substantial rural territory. The conflict then helped justify the army's growing territorial role, right? Because eventually the army defeated Darul Islam between 1959 and 62. Kartosuwiryo was captured in 62 and was executed. But this campaign against Darul Islam, it helped build the military institutions that later central to the new order. We remember the territorial command system, right? It expanded during anti-DI operations. And officers gained experience, in fact, in internal warfare and civilian administration. Now, for your second question then, Suharto later revived parts of the Darul Islam network. In 1970s, intelligence agencies such as OPSUS under Ali Murtopo cultivated former DI figures. They feared political Islam, but also wanted to manage and manipulate it. So the strategy was then to create controlled oppositions, right? Intelligence officers, they infiltrated and encouraged certain Islamist network. This way, radical groups could be monitored, divided, and discredited. Their existence also justified continued military surveillance and intervention. And this policy then produced unintended consequences. What are they? Well, former DI networks, they survived underground. And some veterans, they maintained ideological and organizational ties. And these networks later intersected with former Masyumi activists, Islamic schools, and transnational Islamist currents, especially with the rise of Islamic Brotherhood in the Middle East. So by the 80s and 90s, these connections contributed later to the emergence of Jemaah Islamiyah that we will discuss later. So Abdullah Sungkar and Abu Bakar Ba'ashir, who are the leaders of JI, they drew upon both Darul Islam legacies and modern Islamist influences.
One of the tradition, this is the hardest rebellion that the Republic ever faced during its early year. The source of the ideology, the inspiration, I think, is coming from during the deliberation for independence. That you remember 7 words from the Jakarta Charter, the obligations to adhere Islamic Sharia law for every Muslim in Indonesia, not necessarily Negara Islam, but this, I think, is the sacred for the Islamists. This is a very principle, the main principle of and the main reason to still thinking about having an Islamic state in Indonesia. But then it is as mentioned. The legacy of Darul Islam is not only ideology, but also the infrastructure of organization, and also the infrastructures of the military. They are relatively well trained. They can withdraw tax from the population, so it's really hard to root out. But this movement also becomes, for the military, become the source of strategy, counter-rebellion strategy. I remember that one expert on anti-insurgency, especially Islamic insurgency, that's the name of a neocon named David Kelchelen. He used to be the colonel in the Australian army, and he wrote a dissertation on the anti-Darul Islam campaign in West Java. And then he applied this strategy to Iraq during the war, I think around when they have to face the rebellion, Fallujah, that area, the Fallujah, all of the insurgency and the Islamic, and this never Killsillen advised the Bush administration at that time doing anti-Islamic campaign. But besides that, also the New Order regimes not only infiltrated this to the intelligence, but also creating so many other organizations in order to divide them into smaller groups. Some part of the DITII, Darul Islam movements become one big pesantren in West Java. Even this is a very, very mysterious pesantren Panji Gumilang. And the other is the Golkar affiliated organization called LDII, Lembaga Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, which is a very tight-knit, almost like a secret society within the Golkar. This is an organization that focusing on education, focusing on da'wah. But once you get into this organization, it's very hard for you to come out from this, because they always monitoring their memberships and their members and always asking for a dues. You have to pay a dues in order to join this organization. But the intelligence part, I think it infiltrate into also in the most extreme part of the Darul Islam. Then it becomes several Islamic movements. One of the organizations who hijack the airplane from Jakarta to Thailand, and then Indonesian Special Forces. I think that's one of the best achievement of Indonesian Special Forces was to free the plane from the hijackers and then kill all of the hijackers. And also, I think if you remember, one of the remnants of this intelligence operation was a community in Lampung, in Tawang Sari, and then the Indonesian military crushed these organizations, led by Hendro Priyono at that time, the Indonesian intelligence SARS, even until now. Yeah, and then the peristiwa Talang Sari, I think, killed several hundred people, and also the Tanjung Priok. I think there's a footprints of the DI over there, and then the New Order try to incorporate them, and then if they are too radicals, and then they explode these groups in several places, create the justifications in order to crush them. This is the Darul Islam, but then it becomes another variant of Islamic radicalism.
And I want to note for listeners here that there's a separate, very important insurgency that takes off in Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra in 1976, the Free Aceh Movement, or GAM. But we're going to cover that as one big question later on, even though it puts us a little out of the historical chronology. Last question on New Order before we turn next episode to the fall of New Order. How did politics, or the simulacra of politics, function under New Order? There were three political parties. First, the official party, Golkar, which encompassed people through these so-called functional organizations and was the official kind of military state party. Then there was PDI, the Indonesian Democratic Party, which was the result of this forced merger of nationalist and Christian parties, and even of Murba, which was the party originally founded by the legendary left-wing leader Tan Malaka. And then there was the PPP, or United Development Party, which was the result of the forced merger of four Islamic parties. What was the function of political parties in elections under a system where elections happened, but there was no question that Golkar would always win and that Suharto would always be president?
So the New Order held elections, but elections were never actually intended to determine who governed. The outcome was essentially already predetermined. Golkar would win and Suharto would remain president. Elections were held to demonstrate and renew the regime's legitimacy rather than serving as transfer of power. Actually, Suharto I can't remember if it's in the 70s or the 80s. He came up with he called the elections as a pesta democracy, a festival of democracy or a party of democracy. It's all just basically performance of politics. There is not really a struggle of competing programs, or citizens actually, participated in this contestation. They just participating for party, for festival.
This reminds me of the Democratic National Convention in 2024 in the United States, but
there you go. So it's been replicated just like the Jakarta method. I'm joking. So the party system was simplified in 1973. The Islamic parties were merged into P3, we call it PPP, and the nationalist, Christian, and secular parties were merged into PDI. And then Golkar remained the regime's political vehicle. So this essentially reduced ideological competition and made opposition easier to control. And as we discussed many times before, right, Golkar was not really a party in the normal sense. It represented golongan karya or functional groups. So civil servants, teachers, bureaucrats, business associations, and professional organizations were all incorporated into it. And what's really important also, the state bureaucracy itself became Golkar's electoral machine. I'm going to give you a personal example here, Dan. My late father was a civil servant working for the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And I remember when I was in elementary school, he said this to me. He said, would you be okay if I transfer you from the private school you are in to a public school where it's free? Because he said, I'm tired of voting for this regime, for Golkar, and I want to vote for something else, but that means I will lose my job. Just to tell you what it meant for, people, that you are basically forced to vote for Golkar. So Ali Murtopo's floating mass doctrine was crucial here because ordinary citizens were essentially detached, right, from parties and ideology. Politics was confined largely to election periods, and society was depoliticized, as the state also monopolized political activity. The regime argued basically that Western-style opposition, that created conflict. That is not in sync with Indonesian traditions of harmony and consensus, right? That's what their propaganda is. And also, it's very important to note that the military was very much involved to guarantee this system, this voting system, through Dwi Fungsi ABRI officers. They occupied positions right throughout government and society. They also monitored and making sure that the election occurred as they wanted to. And the new order essentially did not pretend that military rule was temporary. This is not, elections were not there as a transition back to civilian politics. Elections were essentially just a mechanism for institutionalizing military-backed rule.
This is, as I said before, this is the trinity of infrastructure of power. Golkar always win. We know that Suharto will become a president. That for 32 years of my life, in the first 32 years of my life, I experienced the same things, the same presidents, the same winner of the election. But we have also to remember that Suharto cultivates so many things inside Golkar. He cultivates all of the businessmen, all of the, right now we call it oligarch, at the national level and the local level. He worked with they work in tandem with the military at the time. And then they distribute the contracts, government contracts, and government hands out and everything to these people who become the strongmen, the local strongmen. Some of them are criminal organizations or hoodlum organizations. Some of them are real contractors. So, and also it incorporated so many organizations, including the youth organization and student organization. So no wonder until now you see all of these organizations still survive. For example, the Cipayung group, which is consisted of so many student organizations, or also the committee, the National Committee of the Youth, KNPI, for example. It still has an influence until now, and a lot of people are competing to become the leader of these organizations, because the way how to conduct politics and business is still the same. It's like in the New Order. It's really hard to get rid of. I think that for me, that's what's very important about the structure of power during the New Order.
That was Rianne Subijanto, Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 6 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. We're wrapping up with episode 7 next week. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media Indoprogress.com. Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is currently working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, the question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, also rate and review us glowingly. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling other people you know to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.